Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 are popularly known as the Sermon on the Mount. And we're going to be spending about 13 sessions looking at the material that Jesus delivers in those chapters. But we want to look first at the way the structure of this material is, as it's found in these chapters of Matthew. We're going to call this wisdom literature. And the reason we're calling it that is, well, for one thing, it's a typical title that scholars have put on this structure of literature. But I think it's especially appropriate because as Jesus closes out the sermon in the 7th chapter, he gives an illustration of a man who's building his house upon the ledge rock, and he calls him a wise man. And so we're going to call this wisdom literature. And the wisdom of it all has to do not only with the knowing how to live life, but how to do it in actual practice. It's not just a matter of the information, but the application of it, and especially in the scripture materials as they exemplify wisdom literature, it's the matter of living life among men under God. And that is all a wise way to go at life. There are several examples of wisdom literature in the scripture, in the Old Testament and in the New as well. The book of James is another example of it. In fact, the book of James is almost the same length as this Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. And there are some parallels between the two materials. In the Old Testament, we think of the book of Job, the book of Ecclesiastes, the book of Proverbs, and even Song of Solomon as other examples of wisdom literature. The thing about recognizing this as wisdom literature is that the structure into which it's put is different from what we might expect if we are simply reading through the material from especially our Western mind, because we tend to structure things in written form in a different way than is exemplified in these chapters. I prepared a chart here that illustrates at least the ideal that we strive for in the presenting of sermons or in the writing of books. We like to have a major point that's represented here by a long line, and then supporting points that appear under that. There may be more than two, but at least two, that make this obviously true and make us prepared then for the next idea that's in parallel to this one. And then there are supporting materials under that as well. And the whole idea is for this to flow forward as we go through the presentation. Now, wisdom literature doesn't tend to structure itself that way. In fact, it's not just wisdom literature, it's the whole way the scripture is put together as representative of Eastern literary style. There's a tendency there to present it in such a way that makes it very hard for us to outline in the fashion I just got through showing on the other card. The idea here is more the statement of a theme. And we've tried to represent this by a daisy, with the center of the daisy being a representative of the theme that the whole presentation is about. And so, if we're talking about wisdom literature, and if we're talking about the Sermon on the Mount, perhaps we could use our idea of living life among men under God as a statement of the theme here. And then the particular applications of that, or the more specific ideas within it, or illustrations of how that ought to be, can be represented by the petals that are arranged around it. Now, if we could fully represent all of this, perhaps we can make some of the petals smaller and some of them larger to represent the idea that some of these statements take a little longer to make, or perhaps are a little bit more extensive than some of the rest of them. Also, in a lot of cases, and including the Sermon on the Mount perhaps, there's not a lot of necessity for the particular sequence in which these petals appear. The ideas could be arranged in a different order. They simply appear here in this way. If you adopt this kind of a format, you really have a lot more flexibility in the manner of your presentation. And so you could have it rather rigid, in which case this one would necessarily lead to this one and right on around the sequence. But most of the time, it's more of a statement of a theme. And the Sermon on the Mount, I think, illustrates this same kind of an idea, as does the book of Ecclesiastes and James and the other books that illustrate wisdom literature in the New Testament and in the Old as well. When we look at the way the material is blocked out in Matthew 5 through 7, we get something of an idea of the proportion that Jesus assigns to various things that he talks about in there. We prepared another chart to just give you a rough abstract of how all of that appears. The sermon begins with a series of statements we know as the Beatitudes, statements that include the word blessed in some of the English translations, or in some of the newer English translations we have the word happy or perhaps other words. And so we have taken the Beatitudes along with the statement about salt and light and put that together to kind of form a unit that is kind of a combination of responsibilities, being a light to the world, as well as the blessings received from God because we have acted in a certain way according to His will. Then there is a kind of a transition statement down here represented by our orange line. We're going to call chapter 5, verse 20, that transition statement in which Jesus says, "Except I say to you that except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven." Out of this, it seems to me, grows a whole series of statements he makes that are really corrective of various religious practices observed by the religious leaders of his own day. The section of material that begins with chapter 5, verse 21, and goes through the end of that chapter is referred to by this, "But I say to you," in which there is something of a quotation from the Old Testament and then a qualifying statement that Jesus makes. And we're going to suppose that his real contrast is not so much with what the Old Testament actually says, but with the way this material was being used in his own day by the religious leaders. Then when we get down to chapter 6, there are 3 subjects picked up by Jesus that have to do with almsgiving and fasting and prayer. And we've used the word hypocrisy to label this particular section within the larger portion. The idea there is that our heart needs to be in the things that we do, and the behavior that we include in our doing needs to be such that it demonstrates the inner dimension of our lives. And so this whole portion more or less grows out of chapter 5, verse 20, it seems to me, as a corrective on current religious teaching. And then, as we go on into the last half of chapter 6 and open up the next part of chapter 7, in my own mind I have put this together with the idea of trusting God for strength to deal with life as we need to go about it on a day-by-day basis, as well as the inner strength that allows us to relate to other people without being critical of them. We've used the word judge here because that's the way most translations have been reading at that point. After that, there is a section, verses 7 through 11 of chapter 7, that deal with asking God for the things that we need and the confidence we have to have that He will provide those things and not things that we do not want. So we've put those together under this general idea of strength to deal with life and the capacity to relate to other people, including God, in such a way that we can live a trusting way throughout all of our years. Then chapter 7, verse 12, contains the golden rule. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. We've used the word love here because we really think that that is what the verse is talking about, and we will explain that when we get to that particular tape. The sermon closes out with a warning against following false prophets, and he gives some descriptions of how false prophets operate. And then he closes out with a word of commendation for those who listen to his teachings and apply them to their lives as they ought to be, and he compares them to a builder who puts his house on a firm foundation, and contrasts this with a person who builds his life on the sand of life, so to speak. This gives us the broad pieces of the Sermon on the Mount in its own presentation. Since we are dealing with this in a set of 13, we have broken it down into pieces that are useful for our presentation here. Today we're talking mainly about the overview of how the sermon is put together and some of its general ideas. On the daisy here that we have planted on the hill are a breakdown of the other 12 tapes that we are talking about. The first one up here, the blessings and responsibilities, is the first half of chapter 5. And then Jesus in the Law deals with the next segment of about 6 verses in which he comforts the people who are listening to him by saying, don't worry, I'm not here to throw away the law as if it's false or something, but I'm rather here to be the fulfillment of all of those things. After that comes a segment that talks about hate and murder and relating to people in positive ways in order to replace that kind of thing, followed by another paragraph dealing with adultery and divorce. And we're going to be looking at that with 2 tapes, really, both what it says here about the ideals of the kingdom, as well as how this may fit into the larger picture of the biblical testimony about the redemptive aspects of the faith. He comes on down next and deals with some matters about taking oaths and relating to people who might be conceived of as our adversaries, and so closes out then the 5th chapter with that comment. Then opens up the 6th chapter with talking about prayer and almsgiving and fasting, and leads that on into what we know as the model prayer. And so we're going to be talking about the model prayer itself together with some statements found in other places in the sermon that have to do with prayer, so that we might be able to do that in a more effective way. The last half of the chapter I've conceived of as Jesus' attempt to show us how to live life with strength, how to cope with the problems that come our way. And there are some pieces of advice that are implicit in his comments there that I believe are useful to all of us. The 7th chapter opens up with a statement about not judging. Now, we're going to understand this to mean being critical, and so those first 5 or 6 verses are going to be talked about under that heading. When we come on down to the Golden Rule, we're going to spend 2 sessions on that. That's chapter 7, verse 12. One dealing with what he is trying to say in that verse, and the other dealing with its values in everyday relationship to other people. And then, of course, the sermon closes out with the parable about the builders. We want to talk to now, since we've finished the matter of the structure of the sermon, with some of the emphases that the sermon makes. One of these is that men need to remember the inner part of their total being and behavior when they conduct themselves in life. It's not just the outside, the actions that people can see, the words that people can hear, that are of a concern to the righteous man. Because we have a God who knows the heart as well as can see the outer dimensions of our being. And so Jesus spends a good amount of time on subjects in this sermon that really emphasize bringing to bear an awareness of the importance of the inner self in relation to the total life before God. He talks about this when he speaks of anger, and when he talks about lust. He corrects or adds to or qualifies, however you want to think of it, the matter of murder and adultery by saying we need to remember that these outward actions grow from within the way a man is put together. And so if you want to deal with the outer, you have to do that in such a way that the inner is addressed by it. The whole matter of retaliation, the hit-back mentality that some of us get into, really involves us in the way our attitudes within are structured. The hypocrisy that he talks about in chapter 6 is the same way. The matter of the inner intentions and motivations are as important before God as the outer actions that people can see. So the emphasis on the inner as well as the outer is one big stress of the sermon. Another part of it that I think is rather interesting is his insistence on tying together everyday life and whatever ritual or religious observances we can think of in our faith. One of these comes up when he is talking about going to the altar and offering a gift. And there you remember that things between you and a certain neighbor are really not as they ought to be. And what Jesus says is you need to just lay that sacrifice down, so to speak, and go correct your relationship and then come back and offer your gift, which means then that we cannot follow the pattern of ritual observance and satisfy the kind of God that we have. We have to also be carrying ourselves appropriately with the other people that we need to address. In chapter 6, the matter about alms and fasting and prayer have something of this aspect to them as well. That religious observance, spiritual exercise, is not something that you can do just any old way, just as long as you do it, and forget about the other dimensions of life, not only the inner dimension, but the horizontal dimension as we relate to other people as well as God above us. Particularly in verses 21 of chapter 5 through the end of that chapter, Jesus talks about some ideas that he says are not quite it. And it is perhaps a temptation to us to suppose that he is setting himself up in distinction from the law, or perhaps even in contradiction to it. It seems to me, though, from looking at this, that really what Jesus is doing is not that so much as he is objecting to the use of the law in contemporary Judaism. Now, sure, the law is quoted, but even Satan can quote Scripture. The manner in which these things are brought to bear in everyday existence is the thing that he's trying to correct to a great extent. I think it's especially the case in the eye for eye statement near the end of the chapter, as well as the statement, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. There isn't any statement in the Old Testament about hating your enemy as a qualification for loving your neighbor. The next stress that we'd like to point out is that of the horizontal over against the vertical. Now, by horizontal, I mean the relationships that we have with other people and the affairs that we conduct ourselves in during this life. This is contrasted to our vertical relationship to God. The stress in the Sermon on the Mount, not the exclusive object of its concerns, but the stress is more on the horizontal. Now, that stress is done in light of the fact that we live under God and need to keep that at least unconsciously in mind as we go about our everyday tasks. But the idea, to a great extent, is how we need to relate to our fellow man in effective ways so that we do not fragment relationships, but rather build strength in those relationships. Another stress is that we are concerned more in the sermon with this worldly affairs than with the hereafter. We don't have a lot of material in here on such things as the second coming or what the eternal state of man is going to be like. We're talking here about everyday existence, going to work, coming home from work, relating to the family, and those associates and friends that we have around all the time. Now, I don't want to overstress this because there are some places where he talks about what we will receive, even in the Beatitudes that open the sermon. And he talks about heaven, and there are some implications here about the hereafter. But the stress is mainly on this world and how we are to live in it, perhaps in light of where we will be, and perhaps in light of who stands above us. But the stress is on that horizontal relationship in this world. Another thing about it is that in a couple places especially, Jesus, I think, describes the ideas that are important in his mind for us to set up as our ideals. He doesn't always bring in things that could be considered redemptive. As a matter of fact, the plan of salvation and things of this sort really don't appear in the sermon. He is describing rather the ethic that we are to follow, the moral system that we are to commit ourselves to. and doesn't address so much the problem, well, what happens if I fail? And that's where the message of redemption comes in, and the distinctives of the Christian faith are involved. The final emphasis that I'd like to draw attention to is that Jesus is primarily concerned in these chapters with interpersonal relationships more than with legal questions. Now that might be a little hard to see at first because, for one thing, he quotes the Old Testament in some places and he sets forth some ideals that we are to operate by. But I think even though he does that, the stress nevertheless falls on how these things have to do with life as we have to live it with other people. It's not just a matter then of dealing with what God wants us to do, but how that needs to happen. And when we put all of our understanding of the Christian faith into an interpersonal framework, then certain artificial things will fall out because we're not dealing with ideas, but we're dealing with people. And we're not dealing so much with concepts as we are with ways of acting in relationship to other people. So there's a strong interpersonal stress on that in the sermon. This leads into an emphasis that I think we would like to make that more or less pervades the whole of these chapters. And that is, there are some things that tend to work against strong relationships with other people. We can call it depersonalizing if we want to. What we mean by that is we take a person and we relate to them as if they were not persons so much as things or animals or something. The distinctive characteristics of human beings need to be kept in mind all the time. And so in this sermon, I think we find a lot of material that emphasizes the idea of interpersonalizing ourselves with other people. And he gives some warnings that in effect have to do with the ways in which we ruin, so to speak, our relationships by treating people as if they are things. One of these is a legal approach. There is a sort of a legalizing that we have a tendency to do when relating to other people, especially if we are highly concerned about how we ought to live and about how they ought to live. It seems that it's awfully easy for us to get foremost in our minds, now, what is it he ought to be doing, or what is it that I ought to be doing? And the fact is, he's not doing that, and I can get judgmental of him because he isn't, and I can get down on myself because I'm not fulfilling all of those things. Legalizing relationships means that we're always going to be calling each other to question, inasmuch as none of us really ever live up to the standards that we ought to live by. And so in relation to certain kinds of activities, Jesus warns against what we could call a legal approach to it. I think the last half of chapter 5 illustrates this as well as anything else. He talks about swearing as a way of really doing something that's okay with at least the Old Testament law, but as a matter of fact, that kind of a thing gets in the way of relationships. In another place in Matthew 23, you will remember that Jesus has a lot to say in criticism of a kind of a tricky system that evidently was going on in current Judaism, and with certain kinds of oaths that were not necessarily binding in a law court, and where other kinds were. And he's just trying to shove all that sort of thing aside and say, look, you may be able to work out little legal mechanisms to keep yourselves out of trouble or to get other people in trouble. But you have to lay that whole approach aside and concentrate it on the positive interpersonal ways of going about life. If you're going to talk to somebody, just tell them you're going to do it. You don't have to take an oath in order to get them to believe that's what you're going to do. Another way to depersonalize besides legalizing is externalizing. Since persons have an outer as well as an inner aspect to themselves, and these things are in relationship and necessarily are bound together. When we are involved with other people, we cannot just be in surface associations, so that maybe what we say and the movements that we go through are all that we give any consideration to. If we externalize, we have a tendency, therefore, to cause other people not to trust us, because they know good and well, by the way we don't quite bring it off as we ought, that we are not really meaning what we're doing or what we're saying to them. And so the matters about giving alms again, about prayer, and about fasting are things that need to be taken into consideration as externals, and living on the external in the surface relationship instead of living whole person to whole person. A third way of depersonalizing appears in the sermon too, and that is by competing. We've got legalizing and externalizing, and now we have competing. Now the thing about this is it's not so much a matter of leaving out the inside versus the outside. It's not so much a matter of emphasizing concepts more than people in which they reside. Here the problem is more a matter of setting this individual over here and setting myself here. And psychologically, in my mind, the way I feel about it, we are two. And the emphasis is on me in contrast to him. And this is where I think the last part of chapter 5, where we're talking about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and especially verses 43 and following, where he talks about loving your neighbor and hating your enemy. He's trying to get people away from the competition mentality. When you're competing, you have this other person over there against whom you're working. And the implications of Jesus' statements are that that's not the way to build a positive field of life, especially among other people. So in place of that, we could say chapter 7, verse 12, love is the way to interpersonalize our lives. We've looked at the structure of the Sermon on the Mount. We've talked about some of the main emphases and ideas that are here. There are just 3 or 4 main statements that we'd like to close in emphasizing as big pegs upon which the sermon is held together and which it's hung. Chapter 5, verse 16 talks about letting our light shine and doing our good works before other men that they might see them. That's the mission of the Christian. The other statement is in chapter 7, verse 12. The method by which we go about this is living in love. And the last thing is the matter of the standard to which we commit ourselves, the last verse of chapter 5. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. The first portion of chapters 5 through 7 in Matthew that we're going to be talking about in our tape today has to do with this first petal on our daisy that pictures the total layout of the Sermon on the Mount as we're working with it. Blessings and responsibilities has to do with verses 3 through 16 of this first chapter. Before we get into the actual content of the verses themselves, I want to make a comment or two about the structure of the sermon, so that as that structure affects the interpretation of the sermon, we won't be making unnecessary inferences from what the Scripture has to say on these points. We call this wisdom literature, and we emphasize the idea that usually this means that sermon material is put together in a rather loose fashion. Chapter 6 of Luke's Gospel shows us some of the same materials that we have in these 3 chapters of Matthew's Gospel. If we look at chapter 6 of Luke, beginning with about verse 20, and follow on through to the end of that chapter, we see several portions that remind us almost word for word of passages that are found in the Sermon on the Mount. Sometimes people have equated these 2 segments, in fact, because of that. As a matter of fact, they seem to fall at a different point in Jesus' ministry, and so most people consider them actually different presentations on his part. But the point of it all is that even though the material may appear in a rather structured fashion in Matthew's presentation, the fact that the presentation in Luke can rearrange the materials shows that perhaps those connections are not to be made too much of. Otherwise, we may be making points out of the connections that are not necessarily to be obtained simply from the way the material is placed in sequence in the sermon. There are also some places in chapter 13 of Luke, verse 22 and following, in which we have material that sounds like part of what is in the Sermon on the Mount. Particularly there, he is dealing with striving to enter in at the narrow gate, which is, of course, found in the latter part of the Sermon on the Mount. In chapter 16, verses 16 through 18, we have a statement that reminds us of some material coming up in the middle part of the 5th chapter of the Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew. And so we need to be a little careful and remember simply that though we may see certain connections between portions of the total sermon, that Jesus may not have been making those connections as strongly in his own mind as we might tend to see them as we look at what he has said to us. Nevertheless, we are going to lump together the section of verses that we refer to as the Beatitudes, which is verses 3 through 12, and the material in 13 through 16, which has to do with salt and light. That makes a nice pair of ideas, regardless of how closely Jesus intended for them to be associated, because on the one hand, we have statements about being blessed, things that we receive as a result of our association with God and our participation in his purposes for mankind. But then in 13 through 16, we see something of the responsibilities that rather links up with our privileged status as the followers of God and as his sons. And so by putting those together, it at least forms a nice idea for us to be looking at in these materials. The first thing that strikes a person's eye as he looks down through the Beatitudes is the recurrence of the word blessed. It occurs 9 times as he compares 8 different matters to the state of being blessed. And so we need to look at what that word means and what we're to understand Jesus as communicating by it. Of course, when you look at what he calls blessed and those whom he calls blessed, those that hunger after righteousness are involved, those who are merciful, those who are pure in heart, those who are peacemakers, and all those things that are admittedly good and things that a person would want and want to be participating in. And whatever blessed means, in other words, it's going to cover that sort of an idea. But the thing I think is particularly striking is that Jesus doesn't apply blessedness simply to the notion of mercifulness and pure in heart and peacemakers. He also applies it to those who mourn and those who are persecuted, as well as perhaps those who are poor in spirit or those who are meek. All 4 of those last things we've mentioned may not be the thing you might expect blessedness to be associated with. And so, whatever blessedness is, it's the sort of thing that is not dependent upon some of the circumstances in which we find ourselves perhaps as mourners, or on the circumstances in which we might find ourselves as social outcasts because of our Christian faith, or persecuted because of it. So we have to kind of think in our minds, what is it that a person would have that could be called blessed in those kinds of circumstances? So we cast around for some ideas. Actually, the English word blessed, which appears in the older translations like the King James Version or the American Standard, is not exactly the sort of an idea that is in the original word translated here. There is another word in the original Greek that would perhaps better express the notion of blessed. We are really not quite picturing a situation in which one person is blessing another. Now, of course, that's certainly true of those who are peacemakers as well as those who are mourning. God does bless us. That truth, however, doesn't seem to be the main point that is at stake in the use of this expression here, because it's not picturing a blessing idea. A word that has been used in English more frequently in the modern translations is the word happy is he that is a peacemaker, and so on like that. Now, perhaps that's a little bit more current word in our own language. There is a deficiency even with this, because it is pretty obvious, I think, when we think of the word happy, that it has to do with what happens. Happiness and happens are related words in our language. And therefore, I think the word happy for us has a rather light, perhaps shallow, feel to it. And perhaps, therefore, is not the best sort of word for this circumstance, because these are not shallow circumstances. These are not light things that we're speaking of here. And happy would be a rather surprising word to be used in some of these negative circumstances like being persecuted. Although I suppose we could say that when God is on our side, there is a way of perhaps twisting that word happy to make it a description of a person who is working under the will of God. There are a couple other words that may not fit too well in translation, but at least they may help us with the idea. Fortunate is a suggested word in our English language to cover for this idea. You are fortunate despite the fact that you may be persecuted. You are fortunate that you are a peacemaker. Another expression which may be better is well off. We say that a person is well off. And maybe we could say that in respect to all 8 of these things that we call beatitudes, because a person can be well off despite the fact that he is poor in spirit or is mourning, that he is meek or persecuted. So perhaps that word will help us get a feel of what we're talking about here. And just casting around in my own mind to try to figure out what would it be as a statement to describe this word that we would want to use. And I came up with this idea, and you can think about it and see whether it seems to fit the usages of this word. It involves us in a positive attitude toward life, despite temporal circumstances. That is to say, we feel like going on and possessing life and taking hold of it and trying and keeping on with our activities. And we feel that we want to do that and that life is worthwhile and we want to get into it, despite the fact that there are some things in our circumstances that tend to work against that. There is a supply from, of course, beyond us that gives us an inner dynamic and a power to sense the worthwhileness of life despite all those detracting features that we each one experience in varying degrees as we pass through our 70 or 80 years of life. Something of the feel for this perhaps might be gained out of Acts chapter 20, verse 35, which is the only recorded statement of Jesus that occurs outside of the Gospels, that it is more blessed to give than to receive. And it would seem to suggest in that sort of a setting that there is more sense of satisfaction that comes out of giving of ourselves or those things over which we have control than it does in receiving more things. So perhaps this sense of satisfaction is even stronger than the positive attitude toward life. But at least we can say that the state of blessedness involves us in a positive attitude toward the life that we have to live, despite the fact that there may be some things involved in that life that we would prefer not to have there. We've been talking something about what blessedness is. And I think the next major concern that we have is to try to figure out how it is that we have these blessed things. Now, Jesus doesn't give us a long discourse on the mechanics by which all this occurs. He just simply describes the fact that a person who is mourning can have a sense of blessedness even during the time of that. But there are some cues in the list of Beatitudes that I believe give us an insight into how blessedness can be the characteristic of us and how we can gain it by consciously focusing upon that point or that method. I think blessedness is possessed by identifying ourselves with God, who stands above all of these limiting circumstances in which we find ourselves. And He stands above and in control of the persecution, the sources of mourning, the sources of warfare in the world that would call upon us to serve as peacemakers. He is the one that serves as our boldness, that we might be meek in the midst of all of that. So, as you look down through the list of the Beatitudes, you're going to notice that in the first one and in the last one, there is an appeal to heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And in the last one, where we're talking about being persecuted, it says, blessed are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when men reproach you and persecute you. Rejoice and be glad, because they persecuted the prophets ahead of you. Now, part of this use of the word heaven is characteristic of Matthew's gospel. If you look through his gospel, you'll see that he does not, except on just a couple, 3 occasions, ever use the expression kingdom of God. In the places where Mark and Luke use that expression, you'll find Matthew using the expression kingdom of heaven. In the 19th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, there is a mixing of them back and forth, kingdom of God and kingdom of heaven. Consequently, it seems that Matthew, for some reason, wants to emphasize the notion of heaven. And I take this basic idea to mean that our orientation, home base for us, is above all of the things that we are having to experience on a daily basis. And if they happen to be negative, or they happen to detract from happiness or fun or entertainment, nothing ultimate is lost, because the one to whom we are tied stands above all of these changing things that occur from day to day and year to year that we could otherwise, if not connected with Him, feel overwhelmed by. But identifying ourselves with God, we take what we could call a transcendent viewpoint. We look upon life from the standpoint of what is stable, unchanging, up there above all of the change and flux and so on that we are a part of. So by our identifying ourselves with God, we latch on to a source of stability that would not be present if we were only tied to the changing effects of our present circumstance in this life. Transcendent means that God is above these matters, and heaven seems to be Matthew's word to emphasize the transcendent nature of the rule and kingdom of God. I think perhaps one of the reasons Matthew does this is he's concerned with the kingdom idea that has been prophesied in the Old Testament and that the people of Israel are looking for. And it was so easy for the Israelites, because of their conditioning in a political system, to suppose that That was what the Messianic kingdom was going to be like, and that's what the end product of all of God's efforts were going to be. And so on the writing of the gospel, it seems to me that it might be sensible for us to suppose that Matthew uses the word heaven to try to get at an idea of a kingdom in contrast to earth. This is the kingdom of God, all right, but it's a kingdom that is transcendent to this earth. Now, if we tie into that, then we can have blessedness whether or not we are a part of a ruling class, whether we are a subject people, whether we are rich or whether we are poor, or whatever the other affairs of this life could vary according to. So when we identify with God and His kingdom, and identify with the kingdom of heaven, we rise above these kinds of things, and that gives us a stability and a power that we could call blessed. Now there's another thing that you see as you scan down through the individual Beatitudes. The mourners will be comforted. The meek will inherit the earth. The hungry will be fed. The merciful will receive mercy. The pure in heart will see God. And the peacemakers will be called the sons of God. Now when you scan down through Beatitude 2 through 7, you notice that there is a future involved in each one of those things. So I think there's a second prong to this source of blessedness. The first one being tied to the transcendent God who is above all of the flux and change that's part of our world that would take away from our blessedness. And the second is an appeal to the future. Sometimes it's a little hard to cause ourselves to believe this in a real way, but it is nevertheless very helpful to know that a particular sickness that we are now experiencing, or a financial condition that we are in, or a social problem that we are part of, is not going to be this way all of our lives. In fact, it may be over with fairly soon. So by keeping the future in mind, we can, so to speak, rise above the present in which we find ourselves. It gives us another way of looking at this approach to life where we are not limited and tied into the weaknesses and so on of the world of which we are a part. So you might say that the future can be appealed to, and is appealed to in Scripture, as a way of bailing out the present. It is a way of causing us to have a dynamic and power in the present, even though the source of that dynamic is only an awareness of a future reality. So that if we believe in God and trust Him, a kind of blessedness settles in upon us, not only because He is more powerful than all we have to face, but also because we have been told ahead of time that out there in the future, these things that are a source of grief to us now will be brought to an end, and we will be comforted. We might do well to come down through the individual Beatitudes just quickly and make any comments about them individually that might be appropriate. Most of them are fairly sensible and easy to understand, I think. The first one talks about being poor in spirit, and that those who are blessed, and they are promised the kingdom of heaven. The expression poor in spirit is not terribly clear, and various commentators have different ideas on what the main thrust of it is. I think the idea that poor in spirit means we can recognize the deficiencies of our spiritual condition is a helpful way of looking at what is in the verse. Perhaps there's some other way of looking at it, but when we talk about our need yet to grow, we can realize that we are not everything we ought to be, and that in itself, with the hope of the kingdom of heaven, despite our imperfection, brings us a source of blessedness. Those that are mourning are told to feel blessed. They will be comforted. In a country such as where Jesus came from, there was a lot of source of mourning. The ancient world did not have the medicines that are available to at least parts of the modern world, and as a result of that, many people died in infancy, in rather young years, and so there were lots of widows, there were lots of orphans who were experiencing the sorrows that go with that condition of life. The next one that he mentions is the meek. Meek is a sort of a thing where there is an inner security that is part of ourselves, where we do not have to push and clamor for attention in order to make ourselves feel significant in life. We can rest back, we can lay back, we can relax to a certain extent and be ourselves without the worry that if we do that, we're going to amount to nothing and no one is going to recognize how significant we really are. Blessed are those that hunger and thirst after righteousness, which is a rather vivid picture of the desire that a person ought to have if he is going to be the son of the God who is in heaven, striving after the kind of life that he would have us live, both for his glory and for our own benefit. And blessed are the merciful. Sometimes it's a temptation not to forgive. It's a temptation to hold things against people. But if people find out that we are merciful toward their mistakes, they will be merciful toward us, and God operates on that same principle. Blessed are the pure in heart, I think brings up the idea that there is no deceit within ourselves. Our motives are what they ought to be, and we are trying to seek God in the process of life. The peacemakers really do have a source of blessedness, because it's really a lot of fun, to just put it in a light way, to be part of the source of reconciliation for perhaps a couple, or for a church, or for neighbors. It gives a real sense of satisfaction and blessedness to be part of that. And then I suppose we can count ourselves as blessed though we are persecuted, from remembering that, as Jesus said, many of the prophets of the Old Testament were persecuted. It didn't mean at all that God had abandoned them, that they were on the wrong track religiously, but it just meant that that's what happens sometimes when people try to stand for the truth. This deals with the Beatitudes. We want to say just a few things now about the next verses that we have labeled the responsibilities of the kingdom. And Jesus sets this forth primarily under two imageries that we are very familiar with. The first one is light, and the next one is salt. Light is a nice imagery for what I think Jesus is getting at in these verses, because it is we can just remember that when the sun is shining, life feels much more vibrant, and we feel much more on top of the things that we have to deal with. When the clouds are over top of us, well then, we don't feel so much on top of it. But the main thing that light is for, and the thing that I think Jesus is primarily after, is the idea that light enlightens. It shows us where we are so that we don't stumble and fall down. It shows us where things are and how we are to move in relationship to them. And so the idea is that we, God's people at any time, serve as a kind of a light to those who are not His people, to show them the difference that it makes to be one of His people. The salt imagery brings up lots of possibilities. The salt preserves, of course. You can put out fire with salt. Salt is a source of purification. It melts ice. It helps keep us healthy and all that sort of thing. It creates thirst, but the main thing about it, I think, and what Jesus was concerned with, is that it flavors. And the Christian is supposed to be a source of flavoring in his community, in his world. He is therefore a source of influence. And so, really, this segment of the Sermon on the Mount has a very strong mission mandate feel to it. The whole point of it all is that when we live as we ought to, the blessed life, or carrying ourselves in such a way that God's blessing rests upon us, we are going to be doing certain kinds of things. Now, the important thing for us to remember is that when we do things, we don't just do something. We teach something. And when we teach something, we don't just teach something, we urge something. And so, We could call this demonstration evangelism, if you like. Even though we may not be involved in what we think of as vocational ministry, nevertheless, we have a very important role in God's kingdom to perform on a day-in, day-out basis, because really, a lot of people are going to be watching us over a long term to see what kind of light and what kind of flavoring we are in the community before they listen very sensitively to someone who comes to them with proclamation evangelism, which announces the word to them and urges them to come forth and accept Jesus Christ, identify themselves with God through Him. So we have an important role to perform on a day-in, day-out basis to satisfy our calling as God's people. As a matter of fact, I think most of the time it's only during those hard situations in life that very many people are even open to the gospel. And it's our preparation over a long period of time that makes possible a receptive hearing sometimes of the gospel rather than something else in those times when change can happen in a man's life. So we can talk about presence evangelism as the result of our activity for God in the world. So we look back over these materials in verses 3 through 16. We talk about blessedness that comes about because we have identified ourselves with God above and because we anticipate the future in which He brings all things into fruition. And that gives us a source of being well off right now in the present in these circumstances. And then that feeds over into our responsibility to be light and salt in the world. Our study of the Sermon on the Mount brings us this time to the 17th verse of the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. And we're going to be looking at verses 17 through 20 in this part of our study. Referring back to our basic layout of the tapes that we're doing on this three-chapter set of material, we see this second pedal in our arrangement. We have it entitled Jesus and the Law, because there is a consideration given there as to how Jesus' ministry and His teaching is to relate to the Mosaic law that the people of Israel had already received. We might point out that in another way, this is an introduction to Jesus and the Pharisees, because as we hope to show, Jesus is really contrasting His teaching more with theirs than He is with that of the Old Testament law. But these verses deal primarily with Jesus' concern that people not misunderstand what He is trying to do during His teaching ministry. The text says, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or tittle shall not pass away from the law till all things be accomplished. Whoever therefore breaks one of these commandments, these least commandments, and teaches men so, will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will in no wise enter into the kingdom of heaven." I think the first thing we want to consider is why Jesus even makes the statement, "Don't suppose that I have come to destroy the law or the prophets." I imagine that what he is concerned about is, since he is getting ready in these next paragraphs to distinguish some ideas he wants to present from some ideas that the people of Israel have already heard presented in connection with Old Testament statements, he is afraid that they will suppose his contrast is with the law that the Old Testament, the law that the people of Israel had over top of them, that we know as the Mosaic law. Whereas what he's really trying to do is to correct some misunderstandings that have been popularized by the religious leaders of his day. And so he says, don't think that I have come to destroy the law, but in fact it's a matter of coming to accomplish its purpose. Jesus, in other words, implicitly claims by this statement to come within the tradition of what had been done previously by God through the Israelite nation, through the prophets that he had sent to that nation, through the lawgiver, Moses, who had come as the founder, more or less, of that nation for God. And so he is really the fulfillment of its anticipations in a kind of a prophecy fulfillment sense. He is also, in his teaching, fulfilling it in the sense that he is drawing attention to the legitimate underlying principles that were involved in the law, as perhaps distinguished from some of the specifics that came out in the Mosaic Constitution for the Israelite nation. He's trying to draw attention to the fundamental truths that are going to be permanent, that lie within it. And so he is concerned that they not misunderstand his ministry. He wants them to understand that he has not come to destroy the law or the prophets. And when he says destroy, I take it that he means one of several options that people have imagined to be the relationship between what was already done through Moses and what Jesus was going to do in the coming of his ministry. We have a chart prepared here that serves as a summary of some ways in which the law has been approached by people, especially in light of the material we find elsewhere in the New Testament that distinguishes between the Mosaic law or the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Particularly the book of Hebrews works on this in that middle section, starting with particularly chapter 8, where he's contrasting the old law and the new covenant. And so chapters 8 and 9 and 10 are concerned with that in that book. So in this particular statement, when Jesus says, don't think that I have come to destroy the law, the question is, what did he mean by destroy? Now, it seems to me that if you're going to take the word destroy in the normal meaning of what you would expect to be associated with the word, then you're going to be talking about throwing it away as if it were false, as if it were no good, as if it were not of God, and really was not, in Jesus' estimation, supposed to be serving as the governing rule over the people of God. Now, there have been those in the history of the Christian church who have approached the law in this kind of a way. Marcion, in the early years of the Christian centuries, is a representation of this kind of a mentality where there is a strong difference seen between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New. Consequently, what had been done in God's name before is to be repudiated, set aside as false, and the revelation that comes through Christ is supposed to be put in its place. And so I think this is really what Jesus is talking about here. I did not come to repudiate the law and act as if it were not genuine revelation from the true God of Israel. There have been other approaches that have been taken, however, besides the one that I just mentioned. That second one is represented by the notion of adding the gospel to the law. Now, the idea here seems to be what was in the mind of the Judaizing teachers that we run on to in the book of Acts, as Paul particularly is carrying out the missionary endeavor, and these Israelite believers are following him around from place to place, supposedly correcting his teaching and adding to what he has to say, that the people among the Gentiles who became Christians had also to become circumcised and become Jews and put themselves under the Mosaic law, so that you get kind of a combination effect. It's sometimes called Galatianism, because particularly in the book of Galatians, Paul addresses this heresy or false teaching that was going on as led by the Judaizing teachers. Their notion seemed to be that we are saved by Christ, and after we're brought back into relationship with God, then we continue in that relationship by submission to the law of Moses. And of course Paul objects to that, because he says that's really the sort of problem we had before, is that none of us could live up to the expectancies of the Mosaic law. As a consequence, then, we don't want to bring ourselves back under what was a source of death to us. And so he says that this approach to the relationship of the law and the gospel is not correct. And so we're not to suppose then that the gospel is something that's simply added to the law, and therefore we end up keeping both of them, so to speak, or basing our relationship to God upon the observance of the things that he has commanded in the Old Testament law. Perhaps more of a frequent idea is the one that's mentioned here third, amending the law in terms of the gospel. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. We are accustomed to seeing constitutions made for organizations or for nations. And there is usually a provision made within the body of the Constitution that there may be amendments put onto it that will allow certain matters to be adjusted that are really part of the body of the Constitution itself. They are perhaps additions as well as adjustments of the basic content of the Constitution. Now, under this conception, what we have in the relationship of the Mosaic law to the Christian gospel is that the law was given through Moses. And really we are more or less under that same law. Now what has happened is that the things that God does not intend for us any longer to be subject to have been removed through an amendment type process. And so, for instance, the dietary laws that were in the Old Testament, we are no longer necessarily to observe, because we have the statement in Mark's Gospel that Jesus said this, cleansing all meats, so that the removal of the dietary laws was taken care of on an individual basis by this statement that Jesus made. So we can look upon this as an amendment to the basic law that God originally gave to his people. So now if we want to eat pork or something like that, we are doing it without breaking God's law for us, because that aspect of the total law has been amended. The same sort of thing could be done with the observance of Sabbath days and new moons, because Paul says in his epistle that these things are no longer to be a matter of concern. The observance of circumcision as a distinguishing sign for the people of God, it would also be another example of what has been removed from a matter of concern. So, what you do in this approach is to go all the way down through the lists of things that we find in the New Testament which specifically set aside corresponding Old Testament teaching, and remove that Old Testament material then from the list of things that we are to observe in our Christian walk. So ideally then, we are really kind of under the Mosaic law, minus all of those things that we are no longer required to observe. Since Christ has come in fulfillment of the sacrificial system, then we are no longer to observe the sacrifices that were prescribed in Leviticus and other places within the first 5 books of the Old Testament. We don't have to follow the civil legislation that was involved there, because now we're a part of a spiritual kingdom, and so the priesthood and all of those matters have been taken away according to the implications of Psalms 110:4, in which the psalmist says, "The Lord swore and will not repent himself, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek." And that particular verse serves as the backbone for the middle section of the book of Hebrews as we contrast the gospel of the second covenant, or the second testament as he calls it elsewhere, and the Old Testament law. There are some concerns with this approach. This, of course, is better than these other two. We're not trying to deny that the Mosaic law came from God. It's not just a matter of adding the gospel to the law so that we're saved by Christ and then have to maintain that relationship to God by living out perfectly the Old Testament requirements, as Deuteronomy 27:26 says we need to do, continuing to do all things that are required by the law. One of the difficulties with this sort of an approach is that in theory, anything that is not specifically removed, either by direct statement or by indirect implication, we are still under the force of to guide our lives and to control our thinking and our behavior. And it is really kind of a task to try to go through and make sure that all of the specific requirements of the Old Testament that we do not perceive ourselves to be any longer under the control of are in fact able to be removed one by one on the basis of New Testament authority. The procedure that was enjoined for checking to see whether a wife had been faithful or not in the Mosaic legislation, I don't think there's anything in the New Testament that specifically takes that away. Now, you might be able to get rid of it by appealing to the principle we're no longer governed by civil law, and so all of the civil-like laws in the law itself were removed on that principle. But I think it's kind of a hard job to go through and get rid of all of these specifics, because they're not all specifically approached in the New Testament and removed. There is another approach that we find, especially among the early Christians, in trying to deal with the question of their own status as God's people, when, as a matter of fact, the Old Testament law had already been given and they did not conceive of themselves as under it. What they did was pull what we could call an interpretation move. Now, by that I mean that they went through the Old Testament and spiritualized what was found there, and more or less took the episodes, the teachings, and so on of the Old Testament and plugged the Christian teaching into those things. And so they would find, even in the historical sections of Genesis and so on, illustration of the Christian gospel. And so what they were really doing was trying to set aside the literal and plug in a spiritual understanding of that revelation so that they could still keep the law without having to observe the particulars that were contained in the law. Now, what I'm going to suggest here to you is, of course, not new with our presentation here, but it's a matter of abrogating the law. Now, abrogate we're using as a technical term. By that we mean that as a law code, it has been taken away from jurisdiction over us. It is not the specific expression of God's will that we stand under the authority of. Now, it was an expression of God's will, an expression of God's teachings, and it is true, and there's no questioning of that. The question only is, are we under the jurisdiction of that particular expression of God's will? And what the idea then is that we abrogate the law, we set it aside not as untrue, but set it aside as uncontrolling over us, and put in its place the Christian gospel. Now, what this does for us is leave us without particular concern about all the special little things that you might find in the Old Testament the people of Israel and so on were commanded to do, which have no specific removal statement in the new law. So that we can more or less start from ground zero and work ourselves up and know fully what we are supposed to do to be well-pleasing to God on the basis of the new covenant of the new revelation. Now, lest we misunderstand some things in that, I've had prepared here another chart to represent some truths that need to be kept in mind in connection with the point we're trying to make. When we're talking about a constitution, we are talking most specifically about how we are to conduct ourselves, what we are to do. Consequently, there are some things that in this contrast between the law of Moses and the Christian gospel that we are not concerned to make a point of. And those are represented down here on the bottom two lines. Historical matters and statements about the way things really are, the nature of God, the nature of history, the nature of man, the purposes of God, and so on. Now, that's part of a large picture. Maybe I better explain how this diagram is supposed to be read before we go too far here. This is a fat arrow, and the arrow is moving along in representation of the ongoing flow of history. And this light green segment back here represents God's will for His people at this particular stage in the ongoing flow of history. We call it the Mosaic Law. At that time, He had a specific nation that He was the God of, and so it contained statements about the historical origins of that nation. It has a lot of statements about mankind, God's nature, and so on like that. When we're talking then about bringing in place of this law, the Christian gospel, we're talking now about a new law that doesn't so much question the truthfulness of this, but simply say we are no longer under that law. But we still go back to it as a source of correct information about historical matters, because historical matters are not things we do. When we're concerned with codes of law and constitutions, you might say, we are concerned with how we as Christian people are to act. And history is not something you do, it's simply something that you learn and study and become aware of. I have a word down here that may be new to some of us. It's the word ontological. And all we mean by it is that things that have, statements that have to do with the way things are, the way the world came into being, the way man is, the way history goes, what God's purposes are, what God's nature is like, all of those kinds of things are not brought in question. We're not trying to call those false. We're simply observing that that's content of an information sort that's contained within the Old Testament code that was to regulate the nation of Israel and the people that were part of that nation. Now, there are some things that are of a doing nature that we call moral. These matters might be exemplified, for instance, in the divorce legislation that we will be talking about in a later tape within this same series. Depending on how you look at it, the civil regulation in Deuteronomy 24 provided for divorce without any particular cause stated other than some unacceptable thing in the marriage partner, and of course the man was the only one able to call for divorce. Jesus adjusts that, and so that matter of how the marriage state is to operate can illustrate perhaps adjustments in the moral code that's found within the Mosaic Law. Now, in a sense, you have to watch it on this matter because Deuteronomy 24 is not the only material in the Old Testament on that. It's simply the civil regulation regarding marriage, and Jesus makes clear, as does Paul in some places, that Genesis 2 is really the indicator of how God intended all along that marriage should be. But at least we can understand that things commanded in the Old Testament can be adjusted somewhat in the New. They are simply not carried out in quite the same way. Now, some things drop out altogether. The civil regulations would refer to those things that have to do with the way the nation of Israel is organized. The priests were to have certain powers, and not only of a religious sort, but also of an administrative sort. They served as the health officers for the nation, for example. And among the Levites, there was the responsibility for the finances of the nation. And so those kinds of matters were taken care of. There were lots of laws about how neighbors should get along with other neighbors in relation to certain kinds of property rights and matters of that sort. The ceremonial matters would have to do with the sacrificial system that we know about in the Old Testament, as well as other matters that were involved in religious observances in the temple or in the tabernacle before the temple was built, or other things that might be of a more personal sort. they would you could put here under the ceremonial. Now, by and large, we can say at least, those things do not reappear in the new code that has been put in place of the other one. We've used the word civil down here with quote marks around it to indicate there is something of an organization to the people of God. We call it the church, and there are some things said about how we as God's people need to organize and structure ourselves. And so perhaps those are functional equivalents of this, but we don't have a political system, in other words, that we have to keep operating according to the principles of the Old Testament. Then there is certain things we could call ceremonial in the New Testament. There's not a lot of that, at least in comparison to the amount that was found in the Old Law. We have the observance of the Lord's Supper. We have baptism as perhaps a couple examples of things we might call ceremonial within our dispensation. But the general idea here is that so far as those things that regulate human behavior are concerned, we are under a different code from what was in the Old Testament. And we don't by that have to deny the truthfulness of what was there. We simply say it is a truthfulness that it does not now have jurisdiction over the way the people of God operate, because God has now changed this into a new stage with a new stage of purpose in His overall purpose for the flow of history, and we operate then according to the regulations that are ours to observe. So when Jesus says then that I did not come to destroy the law, I think He means I didn't come to repudiate the law and to act as if it were false or to deny that we ought to be observing that. He is simply saying, I have come in the train of that to fulfill what it was in fact anticipating and looking forward to. And so He says this in the expression that one jot or one tittle shall not pass away until everything that it was intended to accomplish has been performed, not only in His life, but the general function that law was to have among the people of God. That, I think, covers some of the main thoughts we'd like to share with each other in verses 17 through 19. In verse 20, we come to a section of material that serves as a splice, I think, between what we've just been talking about in those verses and what is coming up in the rest of this chapter and in the beginning of chapter 6. Here Jesus is talking about exceeding the righteousness of the Pharisees. Now, I have taken this to be a kind of statement of Jesus' plan for what He's getting ready to say in the next paragraphs. And that's the reason, then, that I have felt He's not so much contrasting Himself with the law in the particular places where He quotes it, but with the righteousness of the Pharisees that's seen in those various places as they have used the law. As we just skim down through this material, we can get a general idea perhaps of what we're getting at by observing that he quotes the Old Testament and says, do not commit murder. And of course the Pharisees would quote that. Jesus, however, says, do not get angry. So he makes an additional factor come to play there, and we'll need to talk about what exactly that additional factor amounts to. The next item is do not commit adultery. And Jesus takes that a step further and says, do not lust. The next item is give a certificate of divorcement if you divorce. And Jesus says, do not divorce. The Pharisees say, do not swear falsely. And Jesus says, do not swear at all. In the next portion, there's a quotation found several times in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Do not swear an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, Jesus says, as I have interpreted the words to mean, do not react to evil or do not retaliate. The next item is the second great commandment, love your neighbor. But it goes on to say, and hate your enemy, which is an aspect not found in the Old Testament. Jesus says, love your enemy. As we get into chapter 6, we see the religious leaders, whom he calls in other places hypocrites, involved in displayed giving. Jesus says, give in secret. We see them involved in what we could call pompous praying. but he says pray in secret. They're involved in conspicuous fasting. He says fast in secret. And so the question is, how do these two sets of ways of looking at God's will for life differ? And as we move through these next sections, we'll try to work out how those differences exist. But the main point that we need to make in all of this is that Jesus is not coming in to destroy what God had done before and to act as if that was false and to set that all aside. But he comes in the train of the history that includes the Mosaic Law. And he is the fulfillment of it. And he is also the one who expresses the intent that was involved in setting up what God did set up through Moses for his people as they prepared for the coming of the Messiah that Jesus fulfilled. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 26 have to do with a series of statements Jesus makes in response to the Old Testament law, you should not commit murder, especially as that was understood in Jesus' day. We are taking this section as the first of a series of pieces in chapters 5 and 6 in which Jesus is responding really not so much to the Old Testament law as to the current interpretation of that law by the Pharisees and scribes of Jesus' day. So chapter 5, verse 20 becomes something of a guide verse out of which opens up the series of verses that follow in the rest of that chapter. So we're looking at the first example of what Jesus means when he says to let your righteousness exceed that of the righteousness of the Pharisees. When he quotes the Old Testament law about not killing, he makes an adjustment to that, saying, instead of that, I say to you, don't get angry. And so we want to look at some of the lessons that are involved in these verses in which Jesus responds to this particular situation in the Old Testament. The first principle that I see operating in these verses is the idea that we are not just to restrain from the overt act, but from the inner emotions that accompany that as well. Now that is a serious kind of a thing, because I think there is a tendency for us to suppose that our emotions are something beyond our control, because it is a lot harder to control them. And yet I think we have to recognize that getting angry and showing other kinds of emotion is learned behavior, at least in the way we deal with the inner urges that well up within us. And so I think Jesus is addressing something that is terribly important, because it is out of those inner emotions that the outer acts arise. And so he tells his audience not to restrain just from the overt act, but from the inner emotions of, in this case, anger as well. The second principle that I believe is illustrated in the words that he has to say here about not getting angry with your brother is that we're not to just restrain from the ultimate crime, but we are to restrain ourselves from similar lesser acts. Actually, there's a sort of a mentality that goes not only with the ultimate act of murdering someone, but those preliminary things that might lead up to it. We have to have a certain sort of an attitude toward another person before we let our anger fly at him, or we attack him perhaps with a view to committing murder in mind. Now, in both of these two principles that we've enunciated, I think Jesus gets rid of an unintended legalism that was really in the minds of the current interpreters of among the religious leaders of Jesus' day, but was not really so much intended as God gave the law through Moses himself. The problem is that when we deal with law, there is a tendency for us to consider only those things that are actually said in the law. And we kind of talk about this as the letter of the law. If a particular element is not actually said there, then we do not consider it as falling within the concerns that we could at least take to a courtroom. And Jesus is trying to back his audience away from that sort of an approach to God's revelation to us and say, you've got to look at the implications of what's there as well as the actual wording of what's there. So if it is not good to do the ultimate expression of the anger that wells within us, then we are going to have to deal also and count as not good those lesser things that might lead up to it. The third principle that we can see operating in this general section is that we're not just to restrain from negative behavior, but we are also to make positive effort at reconciliation. Now, this particular principle comes in connection with a statement he makes following the admonitions not to call each other names. He says, if you have your gift at the altar and there remember that you need to make some sort of effort to reconcile yourself with your brother, you better go do that. The problem can be that we can kind of refrain from doing the things that we ought not to do. But we don't always do that by making positive efforts at reconciliation. And so Jesus recommends what we could call substituting a conciliatory mindset for the adversarial one. Instead of conceiving of people as our adversaries, conceive of them as the objects of our concern so that we need to make reconciliation with them. Another principle that's implied, I believe, in these verses is that our relationships with God above cannot be divorced from our horizontal relationships with other people. The leaving the sacrifice there at the altar and going and making amends with the brother illustrates this idea, I think. God is not particularly concerned in our religious acts if we do not concern ourselves also with our fellow men. It reminds us of the parable that Jesus told about a servant who had been forgiven a lot of debt by his master, and then he went out and was not willing to forgive a much lesser debt that a fellow servant owed him. So the parable of the ungrateful servant represents the same kind of an idea again. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul is talking about the observance of the Lord's Supper, we see him in that context doing the same thing Jesus is doing here, tying together how we are in relationship to the other people of the church in this case with the matter of the observance of the supper that focuses our mind on God above. And so that is somewhat the same as our next point, that religious observance cannot be divorced from everyday relationships. There has always been a tendency in religion to pick up on the rituals that are associated with the religion and make sure that those are fulfilled, and divorce the fulfillment of those rituals from everyday life and from relationship to other people. And so Jesus in this section, I think, is trying to show us that that is not an acceptable approach to God or to the things that he has commanded us to do. Now, in saying up here above that we're not to just restrain from negative behavior but make positive efforts at reconciliation, we said that Jesus recommended substituting a conciliatory approach for kind of an adversarial one. Now, the thing that has to happen when we get angry with other people and say things to them that are angry words, angry put-downs, is we have to treat them as if they are things or objects. People that we love, we don't find ourselves easily able to ridicule and to make angry put-downs toward. That point, I believe, is a thread of connection that we see moving on into the next portion of Scripture, where Jesus is dealing with the problem of adultery. It seems to me that the principle applies in the respect that a person is made the object of another person's lust in this matter of adultery. And so we want to move on into that as a second illustration of how Jesus sees a difference between the current way of dealing with the Old Testament regulations and the way that they ought to be dealt with. He says that you have heard that you should not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust after her has committed adultery with her already in his heart. Now, the first thing we have to try to consider here is, what is Jesus getting at when he says that? What does he mean? In a sense, our bodily drives are things that are beyond our control, including the sex drive and the hunger drive and the thirst drive and matters of this sort. And so you kind of wonder, what is Jesus trying to say here? Is it possible even to do what he's talking about? And I think that what his emphasis is the matter of looking on a woman to lust after her. Now, he may have more in mind than this, but it seems to me at least this must be involved, because he's talking about at least matters we can have some control over. We do not have to seek out those experiences that will cause sexual arousal. We do not have to look at the literature and the books that are filled with unwholesome attitudes toward the opposite sex, treating them as objects rather than as people. And so the deliberate act of creating sexual arousal is the thing that has to be dealt with. In other words, in this case, it has something to do with the inner motivations of a person, not just his biological makeup. And so the problem with adultery is that it is an outward act, but it does come out of the inner drives that we all experience. And therefore, we cannot be satisfied with doing something simply about the overt act. We need to do something about what can control the inner desires as well. And so such things as eye control need to be exercised. And that includes, of course, looking at the kind of literature that is able to draw forth these kinds of desires. Another thing that is sometimes mentioned by sociologists is what we call cloth control. The way the other person dresses themselves has something to do with the way in which we can control our inner drives. And then we shouldn't pass by the statement that Paul makes in the opening verses of 1 Corinthians 7. All of the bodily drives that each one of us have a legitimate and an appropriate and wholesome way in which they can be fulfilled. And so Paul says to the Corinthian people that let each man have his own wife and each woman have her own husband to avoid fornication. And so it seems to me that Jesus' main concern in this statement about lust is controlling those things that we can control, because it is important to understand that it's just not the outward act that is the problem, but those inner acts that can lead to the outward expression of those desires. After Jesus goes on through talking about casting out your eye or cutting off your hand or whatever it is that we might parallel with our emphasis on having to take care of the origins of improper desire, he passes into another statement that's derived from Deuteronomy chapter 24. The first 4 verses in that Old Testament book deal with the question of divorce. And so we're coming to a sensitive issue that we want to try to understand Jesus in as best as we can. And the first thing we need to look at in this connection is a matter of the structure or the layout that we are to assume in Jesus' remarks. I have here on this chart 2 ways of looking at the relationship between Jesus' treatment of the adultery issue and his treatment of the divorce issue. Now, we've attempted to represent two ways of looking at the association between those two matters. In this layout, we're more or less considering the divorce issue to be a subcategory of the whole teaching that he gives on the matter of adultery. Now, if we do that, then we're going to see a certain coloration put on what he says here, because we're going to conceive of it as really a subpoint within this larger framework. Now, over here on the other side, we have thought of it in a different way. We have thought of it as having two entries. One of them in which he deals with the adultery issue, and then as a separate item altogether, the matter of divorce. Now, in favor of looking at it this way, of course, is the introductory formula that is applied to both of the portions dealing with adultery and then divorce. You have heard that it was said, but I say unto you. And so for that reason, we may be more inclined to take this kind of an approach, although you will notice in various translations a different way of handling the relationship of these blocks of material. The American Standard Version in the English language treats it this way. Some of the newer English translations are putting these portions as separate entries. Now, the reason that this is important so far as the interpretation of the passage is concerned is that if we take those last two verses, verses 31 and 32, as a subpoint under the larger framework of adultery, then we would be more inclined to understand these verses to mean what some people take them to mean, and that is that Jesus is putting down what is called legalized adultery. That instead of going on and committing adultery with the person that you would be doing it with, you divorce your wife and marry that person. So in effect, the motivations are basically the same as those involved in adultery, and so it's a kind of a subcategory under all of that. That also raises the possibility in some people's minds of re-understanding what was really meant in the Deuteronomy passage, chapter 24, when Moses allowed for divorce to be done. It's simply that they had to give a bill of divorcement to the wife, and she could then become the wife of someone else, and he could marry whom he would. Some interpreters suppose that what is being really talked about there, and therefore objected to by Jesus, is the matter of betrothal, and then after the marriage has either come to completion or whatever, the bride or the wife is discovered to have been unfaithful. Just in general response to these possibilities, the legalized adultery, the betrothal approach, or another one what's called incestuous marriage, it seems to me that those are too explicit and too particular, too specific to fit into the general flow of what Jesus is talking about, because he states his position in very broad terms. And in other places where he says similar things, there's even less context to cause us to think of a restricted viewpoint. Chapter 10 of Mark, verses 11 and 12, have just a general statement about this same matter, and Luke, chapter 16, verse 18, has a general statement like that too. And you could look at Matthew 19 as well, when Jesus treats this divorce issue in all of those passages. So it seems to me that we cannot really appeal too much to the structure issue here in deciding what is involved, and so we can kind of take the option of legalized adultery as one possibility at least, but not necessarily try to limit what Jesus is talking about to that matter. The next thing we have to consider is not so much the structure, but the setting in which Jesus' comments are to be understood. And there are different ways in which commentators approach these statements about divorce. And the reason they do is because they approach the whole sermon in different ways. The first approach that you could take toward the whole sermon, and therefore toward these specific things, is that when Jesus is talking about a contrast between what was in Deuteronomy 24 and what he's saying, is that he is making a contrast within Mosaism between the civil code and the moral issue. Now, what this does is conceive of Deuteronomy chapter 24 as a kind of a civil regulation that Moses allowed, as Jesus says in Matthew 19, because of the hardness of the hearts of those in his own day and of that nation. When you read the Old Testament entirely, however, you see that God, in God's heart of hearts, he had a much higher view of the man-woman relationship than is expressed in Deuteronomy 24. Much of the teaching in the New Testament about marriage and adultery and fornication all go back to the last part of chapter 2 in the book of Genesis and base their understanding of the marriage relationship upon the nature of the situation that God created originally for man and woman to take part in. Also over in the book of Malachi, chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, there are some statements that relate to the issue of divorce, and God says that He hates divorce, according to one of the translations, and conceives of it as the husband dealing treacherously with his wife. Now, if we conceive then of Jesus' comments as taking place within the confines of the Mosaic law and within the time of the Mosaic dispensation, then really what Jesus is doing is trying to get his audience to see that even within the Old Testament, God really, in his heart of hearts, did not prefer what was, strictly speaking, allowed in Deuteronomy 24. So it would be a contrast between civil divorce and the real nature of marriage within the Old Testament revelation generally. The second approach conceives of Jesus' teaching as a contrast between Mosaism and the millennium. That is to say, there is an approach to the whole interpretation of the Sermon on the Mount that says, this is the guidelines, these are the laws, this is the way things are supposed to be during the time of the millennium that's talked about in Revelation chapter 20. And when that comes to pass, when Christ returns again and sets up his kingdom on earth, then what is talked about in Matthew 5 through 7 is going to serve as more or less the constitution for that circumstance. And so it's a contrast between what was allowed during the time of the Mosaic law and what is going to be the case when the millennium comes to bear and the kingdom on earth is set up. That gets us into some very complicated issues about how things are going to be in the future, but we list it at least as one of the ways of going at this passage. A third approach to Jesus' comments is to see them as a contrast between Mosaism and Christianity. And the idea then is that in the Old Testament, true, God allowed divorce, and there was, legally speaking, no stigma to be attached to it. But in the Messianic age, in the church age, that is going to be changed. And the real intent of God that was present really from the beginning is going to be brought to bear. Now, it seems to me that though this is an interesting question of how are you to view Jesus' statements here, whether within Mosaism, during the time of the millennium, his comments would be applied, or whether it's a contrast between Christianity and Judaism, is really, in a way, an immaterial question. Because any way you look at it, you come out with the same real intent on God's part. Even during the time of the Mosaic Law, it was clear, at least as Jesus points out that clarity, that God really intended for a man and woman to be one, a psychosomatic whole, and that they were to maintain that relationship and that identity as an expression of the image of God within them. If you read chapter 1 of Genesis, it's male and female that God created it, and in his image he has made us. And I think really the image of God that is part of the human identity involves the matter of marriage as well as some other things. And so even within the Old Testament dispensation, it would be clear what God's intent was. Whatever might be true in the future, we'll see when the future gets here. And it's obviously the case that the Scripture in the New Testament talks about a commitment between man and woman that is to be permanent for life. So it seems to me that when you get down to the end of it all, you really don't have a problem that remains a permanent problem, because the dispensational question more or less dissolves in light of what Jesus is really trying to get at, which arises out of the very nature of marriage itself. One more issue that we need to try to look at in verses 31 and 32 is the expression makes her an adulteress. He says, I say to you that every one that puts away his wife, except for the cause of fornication, makes her an adulteress. Now the thing that is curious about that is, how is it that he makes her an adulteress? And there are several options that have been brought up. One option is that he makes her an adulteress by exposing her to prostitution. If she has been dismissed from his household, the only way by which she can support herself is through this means. Now that is probably true in lots of places in the world today. I'm not really so sure that that would have been the situation in first century Judaism. And so I think probably that would not have been particularly in Jesus' mind, although it might have application in some circumstances. The second option has been brought up, is that he makes her an adulteress in the sense that he treats her as if she were an adulteress. That is, he makes her an adulteress by treating her like one. To society around, he in effect says, this woman is an adulteress. If, as a matter of fact, the only grounds for dismissing her as his wife is adultery, or really unchastity here, then, as a matter of fact, when he does that, the implication to others is that she is in fact that. A third way is that he has made her an adulteress by the way he has used her. This, as well as the previous idea, looks back on the former marriage circumstance and conceives of the adultery as being a label arising out of a previous way of relating to her. It seems to me, however, that the fourth option that we have down here is the best one, and that is he makes her an adulteress by her new marriage. In other words, he has put her in a position where, as a matter of course, she will in fact remarry. And when she does this, she is put in a position that is, theoretically speaking at least, not the kind of circumstance in which God has set up as the ideal for his people. And so I think it looks forward instead of perhaps backward. And the reason for saying it's looking forward to the new circumstance is that he is talking about the person that marries her also committing adultery. And so there's a forward look to the flow of these verses. He's assuming remarriage. In a similar statement over in Matthew 19, it's certainly the case. He says he commits adultery against her when he marries someone else. So it seems to me we're looking forward to her new marriage. We still have a curiousness about this passage that we'll not be able to settle here completely in our session this time. And that is, it sounds like when he says it makes her an adulteress, that the blame rests on her. And yet, if you emphasize the word make, it sounds as if the blame rests on him. He makes her an adulteress. Evidently, there is some kind of a special usage of words involved here, because otherwise it seems as if it's almost a self-contradictory statement. So, for my own part, though this is a very difficult issue, I believe that what Jesus is really getting at is that in terms of the nature of marriage, God intended for one man and one woman to be identified with each other and committed to each other permanently. And that in all of this, his main idea is that there cannot now, under his will, be divorce without sin being involved in that some way. Consequently, this is a difference from Mosaism, which allowed, at least from a civil standpoint, the matter of divorce. And Jesus is simply then trying to tell his audience, this is not the way God ever wanted it, and this is certainly not the way that it ought to be among us who are more enlightened according to his will. The treatment of this material in verses 27 through 32 involves us in some sensitive issues. There's a lot of heartbreak and sorrow in the lives of many people because of this experience, either to themselves or to those that are very close to them. And we simply recognize in all of this that God has not intended for human life to bring sorrow, especially in those more intimate close relationships that can mean so much more to us than other things can mean. And his idea is that God originally intended for us to be one man and one woman committed and identified with each other for life. And that if there is a division that exists in that, sin has to be involved in that somewhere. In our next session, we're going to try to look at some other issues that are related to this particular matter. But I think this is the main point Jesus is making.